one of the most wonderful parts of being at FDA and Cedar was being in this collegial, non-competitive atmosphere. And when I came across a challenging issue, I could go chat with my mentors, with Bob Temple, with Ellis Unger. And that really benefited not just FDA, but it benefited industry and really the American public. And there will be others who will eventually assume those roles of guiding policy and transmitting what is basically FDA tradition, but this has been a shock to this system.
Hello, I'm Wayne Pines. Welcome to bonus episode number 5 of FDA Watch.
And I'm Shelly Gard, and thanks for joining us today as we continue releasing our bonus episodes to keep you informed about what's happening at FDA during these troubling times.
The terrific response we've received from hundreds of subscribers to these bonus episodes has further strengthened our commitment to keeping you current on FDA developments. That's why we encourage you to subscribe to FDA Watch so you won't miss a single episode, whether it's on one of the 4 core areas we cover or on a groundbreaking series such as the one we just completed on AI with the support of the law firm Arnold & Porter, or like this bonus episode in which we'll discuss the most important FDA developments in drugs, devices, food, and cosmetics in the first half of the year. And we have just the right guests to guide us on that journey, so let's meet them now.
Thanks, Wayne. First up is Naomi Lowy. Naomi most recently served as Deputy Director of the Division of General Endocrinology. She served at FDA for 18 years. She is now a Principal Drug Regulatory Expert at Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara in Washington, D.C. Welcome to FDA Watch, Naomi.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Also joining us is Claire Davies. Claire is a shareholder at Polsinelli, where she counsels clients on regulatory issues affecting medical products. Before joining Polsinelli, Claire spent nearly a decade in FDA's Office of the Chief Counsel. Welcome to FDA Watch, Claire.
Thank you, Wayne and Shelly. Glad to be here.
Now let's welcome Angela Diesch. Angela heads Amin Wasserman Gurnani's cosmetics industry practice. She advises clients at all stages of product development, including determining correct product classification and whether pre-market notifications are needed. Welcome to FDA Watch, Angela.
Thank you so much, Shelly. I'm happy to be here.
And finally, let's meet Frank Yiannas. Frank is a renowned food safety leader and executive. He served as the Deputy Commissioner for Food Policy and Response at FDA, a position he held from 2018 to 2023. He spent 30 years before that with Walmart and the Walt Disney Company. Welcome to FDA Watch, Frank. So here's the format for this bonus. We're going to ask each of our guests to discuss the top 3 developments in their core area, either drugs, devices, foods, or cosmetics. The guests will each discuss their top development, then we'll go around again, hear their second, and then finally the third one, which will come after the break. So let's start. Naomi, if you could start out by talking about what your top development is in the first 6 months in the drug area at FDA.
Thank you, Wayne. So I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'd say that the biggest development in the drug space in the last 6 months, the absolute biggest news story has been just the sheer amount and pace of new developments rolled out by the new commissioner. It's an absolutely great time to be covering FDA news because there is no shortage of stories. And those of us professionally invested in FDA developments wake up every morning wondering what announcement will be made today. It's just the stream of new initiatives, announcements, and policies are all flowing at this pretty unprecedented pace. This administration clearly does not want business as usual at FDA, and we're seeing that reflected in the flurry of announcements. And I'd categorize these announcements into a few different buckets. The first bucket of announcements have been received well because they make sense, and perhaps they've been a goal for many years across FDA and industry. And they really are rooted in some strong scientific and ethical principles. And I'd say an example of that is reducing animal testing. Mm-hmm. That's where there's been a lot of support to move in that direction. The second bucket of announcements that I'll talk about are what I would call feel-good policies. And these sound positive at first glance, but there are details left out so that we may be left scratching our heads about their impact, or it's unclear that these can logistically be implemented, and it's unclear how the scientific staff in the divisions will integrate these into drug review. So essentially, what I'm wondering is there a disconnect between the aspirational nature of these announcements and the reality of the boots on the ground, the folks who actually have their hands on the data? And some of the examples here are the commissioner's novel pathway to approval for ultra rare diseases that he says will be based on a so-called plausible mechanism of action. So okay, so he's right that there are situations in which substantial evidence of effectiveness cannot be established with a traditional, adequate, and well-controlled trial, and flexibility is required. But what is the framework, and how are the review teams integrating this into their feedback, into their benefit risk calculation? Do they buy into this? And what constitutes plausible mechanism? And is FDA already doing this to some extent? And if so, how is this different? Another example is the newly announced priority voucher program that promises a hyper expedited review, but now seems to be contingent on the promise to lower drug costs. And FDA reviewers have not historically prioritized programs based on cost to the American public. And also in an environment in which staffing is critically low, are teams going to be asked to pause other work to prioritize one program that's based on drug cost to the American public? So these are potentially tremendous opportunities, but the details around how they will be implemented are needed to understand if these will be historically impactful or mere sound bites.
How do you think that the staff is reacting to what is going on?
Understanding from my contacts, my former colleagues at FDA, is that they're often unaware of what is being rolled out. That we often find out about some of these initiatives before they do, and they are surprised. I do understand that the commissioner has recently announced that he is having a so-called internal listening tour with drug reviewers, and I think that is a positive development. I do think he needs to go around and hear from them. Ideally, it would have been good for him to hear from them many months ago, but better late than never. But it does sound like they are often caught unaware of some of these new initiatives.
And one more question before turning to Claire. In terms of numbers, do you have any sense of the numbers of people in the Center for Drugs, CEDAR, who are no longer there? The statement has been made by the commissioner that drug reviewers were generally retained, but do you have a sense of those numbers?
So approximately there has been a substantial decrease in headcount. The numbers that we have heard have been about 20% across the board. And while it is technically true that scientific reviewers in the divisions were not part of the reduction in force, there were many supportive staff, including policy folks who support the divisions, who were included in the reduction in force, other staff that were critical to supporting these divisions. And then there were a number of reviewers in the scientific divisions, leadership as well, who left for various reasons. So the third bucket of announcements is also these feel-good policies that show a lack of historical knowledge or sophistication around FDA. And examples of that would be announcing this radical transparency initiative of publishing complete response letters when they have already been published, perhaps not all in one convenient collection, or announcing eliminating industry representatives from advisory committees. Those industry representatives were non-voting. So the bigger issue with the advisory committees is that the experts without conflicts are often ones that don't know the disease or topic well. So I'll stop there, but that's my big development number one, which is not a one-word answer.
Thanks, Naomi. Turning now to Claire. Claire, if you will, give us, your top development in the device space in the last 6 months.
Yeah, thanks, Shelly. This one was a bit amazing to me because I think it already seems to sort of be yesterday's news, but to me it sort of has to be the decision vacating in its entirety the FDA's final rule on laboratory developed tests, or LDTs, and the government's decision not to appeal that. I think the audience for this podcast will be well familiar that in 2024, FDA issued a final rule, essentially codifying its position that LDTs are medical devices and signaling the agency's intent to begin actively regulating, no longer exercising enforcement discretion over a large proportion of LDTs. And, what that was really predicted to be a seismic shift in the device regulatory and healthcare world, swiftly challenged in court by ACLA and others. And it was only in March of this year that we got the Eastern District of Texas District Court opinion that vacated the rule. And, invoking Loper Bright, that court found that the text of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act did not provide for FDA to regulate LDTs as devices, and found that they are instead professional services. And the deadline for the government to appeal expired, I believe, at the end of May. And I think there's been, pretty broad consensus in the commentary around this that, absent legislative change, we're unlikely to see renewed broad efforts to regulate LDTs under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And so I think, the effect is essentially right now maintaining the status quo. So perhaps it doesn't feel like, a development.
Sure.
But I think if we think about what the opposite, might have been if there had been a narrower opinion from the court, if there had been an appeal, if you'd gotten a different decision, I think that this would have been a huge focus for the lab industry and the agency in terms of resources. So I think that was a huge development. And the other thing is, dovetailing on sort of what Naomi was just saying, perhaps, there's been so much change coming out of the agency that the impact of this decision, kind of hasn't been something that I think we've seen a lot coming out of FDA on, but there are some questions that it raises that I will be, sort of looking to see in the future, how the agency addresses this. For example, in the past, people have submitted PMAs and pre-submissions for things that they've identified as LDTs. And what is, what is the effect of this on those submissions and on FDA policies going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. And certainly that is an extremely important development. What about for labs that had already, obtained FDA approval for LDTs under the prior rule? I mean, I guess any thoughts on how they are to navigate, this new development, and whether their approvals are considered void, or just sort of how would labs sort of interpret the current status and move forward?
I think it depends on the position you're in. We certainly have not seen anything out of the agency on that. It in some cases it's not required, to identify a product as, an LDT or not. That's not a requirement when you submit something. So in some cases, it may not be something that the agency is really looking at it or that they're thinking about. But
Sure.
if in most cases, I think companies that have gone through the effort to get the 510K or the PMA approval, that's valuable. And they probably want to keep that, right?
Yep.
So I think, that does raise a question. The court made pretty clear in their opinion that things like test kits, that are shipped, IVD test kits could fall within the definition of devices. And it's possible that you could see companies thinking about restructuring their operations a bit to sort of, if they wanted to ensure that they fall outside of the scope of what is an LDT. But I think right now, probably the people who have PMAs happy to
Yeah.
keep them.
Yeah. And I know, with the proposed rule or the final rule and its development really over the years, there's been sort of this pull and tug on, bringing LDTs to the same kind of standards with respect to QSR systems, versus kind of I guess this other side where there's maybe a bit more of a stall on patient access and innovation. Where do you see, I guess, the current framework is now? I mean, um, obviously, the ruling, it could be seen as a win for patient access to certain tests, particularly those for rare diseases, as it would remove barriers to LDT development and availability. But then at the same time, it obviously, by no longer subjecting LDTs to pre-market review, QSR systems, right, as medical devices, may no longer apply. So just curious as to your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we remain largely where we were before. That
Yeah.
I think there's been an acknowledgement by the agency that, including, in the final rule, that there are beneficial tests offered, that have been offered as LDTs historically, and that are important to patient access.
Mm-hmm.
But there have been, and I think everybody acknowledges this, there have been some problematic tests where the FDA doesn't currently have oversight. So I will be interested to see if
Yeah.
this is an issue
Yeah.
that Congress takes up, or if they look at making changes to CLIA, because
Mm-hmm.
that was another part of the court's opinion, that there was this sort of additional statutory scheme
Mm-hmm.
that these products are subject to, and maybe that will be an avenue.
Yeah.
You could potentially see them putting this within the scope of CLIA.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. No, thank you, Claire. Moving to Angela. Angela, we would love to hear the top development in the cosmetics space that you've seen in the last 6 months.
All right. So to ask me what the top developments were in cosmetics in the last 6 months, I would initially say it doesn't really come from the FDA, right? I mean, we've had a lot of developments outside of the FDA, from state restrictions, EPR enforcement, or development rules and reporting. But if you're just looking at the FDA, I think the top issues in the first half of the year for cosmetics continues to come out of the requirements and obligations established under MOCRA, the Modernization of Cosmetics Regulations Act. I know you have had other discussions regarding MOCRA recently on your podcast. I won't go into much of it. However, the first half of the year was really plagued, I think, with some uncertainty for cosmetics around how the administration's 10 out, 1 in deregulation proclamation would really work, right, with the requirements for some proposed rules that the FDA is supposed to announce as a result of MOCRA. That combined with budget cuts and layoffs, I mean, the development of some of the proposed rules had already been stalled because of just too much work and not enough staff around it. So, as required under MOCRA, industry is still waiting for the FDA to take steps towards the development of the fragrance allergen labeling rule, as well as the good manufacturing practices for cosmetics rule. Both of those proposed rules were both due last year. However, in the fall 2024 unified agenda, FDA announced that the GMP rule would likely not be released until October 2025. And then regarding the fragrance rule, I don't believe they've actually yet announced an anticipated updated timeline for the release of the proposed rule. So I get questions almost weekly from various cosmetic companies asking, hey, has this been announced yet? What do we need to do, right? So there's this anticipation and I think anxiety within the industry, at least with some companies, about what these things are going to look like. And because especially with fragrance allergens, there's some companies that they're very sensitive to these issues, and they do not they want to know is this going to look like the EU rules, or is it going to look completely different? So I think that's kind of the top issue.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also in May of 2025, FDA held a meeting regarding asbestos in talc containing cosmetics, and that was also a requirement under MOCRA that they would look at that. And during that meeting, it was really I think the takeaway from the meeting is it really seems like FDA is leaning towards a complete ban on talc. Just from the discussion from that meeting, and they do have additional meetings that are planned. And then the final thing is, PFAS, and I don't really see this as such a huge issue at the FDA level, just because there's been so many states that have already taken steps to banning PFAS, forever chemicals, in cosmetics. However, we are supposed to see a report issued by the FDA regarding the safety of PFAS in cosmetics by December of this year. So those are kind of like the big things at the FDA for cosmetics, from as far as what I'm seeing from the questions from industry.
Okay, great. No, thank you, Angela. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Wayne, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, let me turn to Frank now. Frank, there have been so many developments in the food area. I don't even know how you begin to isolate any of them, but could you discuss what you would regard as the top development in the food regulatory area in the first half of the year?
One of the things I think your listeners probably have already heard about, have seen in the news, is just the RIFs, the reduction in workforce in general. And I think everybody's asking me, at least, Yiannas, based on your tenure there, what do you think these reductions in the workforce will mean to food? Because I'm glad you're including food in an FDA discussion. Sometimes we forget that the F stands for food and not Federal Drug Administration. It's the Food and Drug Administration. But I always begin by answering that question, Wayne, with the empathy that, this means men and women who have dedicated their careers to public service have lost their jobs. A lot of those I've worked with, their friends, their colleagues, some of them work for me. And so you always have to express concern when people lose their jobs. But then I also pivot and remind people, if you've worked in the private sector, and I spent most of my career in the private sector, obviously honored and privileged to have served almost 5 years at FDA, these types of RIFs, reductions of workforce of 10 and 15%, are nothing unusual. And so, we tend to go somewhat crazy when it happens in the public sector. But my general take on it, it's significant. We've lost about 15% of the workforce. Those are the best estimates. We don't know for sure. We know what that means to the foods program. We've heard the types of positions that have been eliminated. And the question is, will that affect FDA's ability to do good food safety and nutrition work? And the answer, quite frankly, is it depends. It really depends. If the organization doubles down and says, we're going to use this as an opportunity to create more modern ways of working, it could be a good thing. If they don't, I think it could be bad for public health. But as one small example, Wayne, when I was at the agency, we rolled out, really at that time, the first use of artificial intelligence and how the agency did its food safety work. And we layered predictive capabilities through machine learning into the FDA import system called Predict. To make a long story short, with the year's pilot, we were able to show that we could increase our predictive capabilities of finding violative seafood shipments by 300%. Just think about that, a whopping 300%. And what we were able to say to Congress, it wasn't to eliminate positions, but we realized food import lines were increasing exponentially year after year, and we just couldn't continue to throw humans or labor at it. And so that's an example. If the FDA uses this moment, and I haven't heard the plans, but I hope I will, that they're going to really modernize and transform the way they do their work, then I don't think it means anything, and it might be beneficial. If they don't, then it could be tough times, work not happening, things taking longer to get done. And so time will tell.
Thank you, Frank. Let me turn now back to Naomi for number 2. What is the second most important development? And in your first answer, you gave a number of different different things. But what other things are important in the drug area at FDA in the first half of this year?
Wayne, my big development number 2 is the unprecedented exodus of FDA experts who have massive cumulative years of historical knowledge and are now in industry or advising industry. Of course, there have been notable exits of FDA experts in the past, but not at once. And it's tough. It's a tough position to replace that entire body of expertise, because with that historical knowledge comes regulatory flexibility, understanding precedent, and appropriate innovative policy making, and passing down that knowledge through the generations of reviewers at FDA. So if we say roughly 20% of staff have gone, many voluntarily, that translates into some meaningful impacts. And I do want to note that the impacts have been heterogeneous, meaning some divisions in office have been minimally impacted, and it's more or less business as usual in those, but others have had greater impacts. And just reflecting from my experience, one of the most wonderful parts of being at FDA and Cedar was being in this collegial, non-competitive atmosphere. And when I came across a challenging clinical trial design issue, I could go chat with my mentors, with Bob Temple, with Ellis Unger. During COVID, I could just call Dr. Temple and we talk through complex issues. And that really benefited not just FDA, but it benefited industry and really the American public. And there will be others who will eventually assume those roles of guiding policy and transmitting what is basically FDA tradition, but this has been a shock to this system. And Stat News has been keeping a running list of senior officials who have left FDA. And it's devastating to think about what's been lost from the agency. And it's not so easy to rebuild. Developing and training a new reviewer is almost like raising a child. It takes time, patience, and experience to refine one's regulatory skills. And it's also about the privilege of being around those intellectual giants at FDA, brilliant people who have so much expertise to share. So the commissioner has said that they are hiring, but I and others wonder who will be attracted to this environment, who will train them, what will the next generation of reviewers and leadership look like? And everyone is eventually replaceable, but it's not such a simple task in the world of complex regulatory and scientific decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you, Naomi. I had an opportunity to work closely with CDRH ombudsman on a client matter recently, and I think the morale, like you said, is so low, and this individual kind of made it a point to say, please let the appropriate people know that you value kind of our expertise, because we're not sure if we're going to be here. And that was really kind of astounding. I think they serve an invaluable role, in all departments and all divisions of the FDA. So I think that brain drain and sort of passing of knowledge is extremely critical for continuity. And I agree, important development. Claire, we'll turn to you, if you could comment on sort of the next big development that you're seeing, or that you have seen in the first half of this year on devices.
Sure. And it's certainly an area where loss of expertise at the agency could be felt, very, very deeply and greatly. But I have to mention AI. I was considering being contrarian and not mentioning it, since it's really all I think those of us who work with folks, in business, but also in the FDA space, it's really all that you are largely hearing about these days. So my development is the Trump administration and FDA's sort of approach to and focus on artificial intelligence. Earlier this year, the president issued a new executive order to replace former President Biden's executive order on AI. And President Trump's executive order really directs a shift in AI policy to focus on promoting it as a means of, sort of global dominance. And I think we've seen, the commissioner refer to sort of unleashing AI, and he has clearly indicated that it is a priority of FDA's. In one of his JAMA articles, Commissioner McCary indicated that it's going to, the agency is going to modernize how it reviews AI-based technologies, and rethink the approach to AI. So, I think that while the focus that we have seen so far in terms of concrete developments coming out of the agency have really been on use of AI as sort of an internal agency efficiency tool, right? The release of ELSA and talking about speeding reviews and making them more efficient with use of AI. I think that the sort of change in approach and the real focus on committing to this as an area of innovation is an important development, because this is just such a critical issue for AI enabled medical devices and the folks developing them, because I think this is an area where the agency has struggled, in terms of how you can fit the existing statutory and regulatory device paradigms to this sort of emerging, kind of field. And although really not emerging anymore. So I think it signals, different approaches. And I really wonder if we're going to see, for example, changes to the agency's policy for clinical decision support software and the scope of clinical decision support, or CDS, that is excluded from the definition of a device. You've seen, a number of people, including I think former Commissioner Gottlieb, make commentary about, potentially the current approach of the agency is sort of holding back some innovation in that area. I also think that you saw some final and draft guidance get issued by FDA right at the tail end of the Biden administration on things like policies for AI enabled software functions, and so I expect to see some potential changes, either into those guidance documents or perhaps just, announced less formally about the agency's approach in this area, specifically for AI-enabled medical devices.
Thank you, Claire. That's obviously an extremely important update, and appreciate your comments on that. Angela, we'll move to you for sort of second key development in the first half of the year on cosmetics. I know you spoke about sort of developments on the FDA front with respect to MOCRA and the various kind of stages of rulemaking. If you'd like to comment sort of outside of FDA, what you're seeing at the state level, and or also curious to understand your comments on FDA's enforcement and any enforcement developments, with respect to cosmetics or MOCRA, that would also be great.
Well, so what I was referring to when it comes to enforcement, which this was going to be my second topic, is enforcement. So, I'm seeing an uptick in, well, maybe it's not an uptick, but I am seeing more and more requests for scheduling inspections of foreign establishments. And I know it was previously talked about on your podcast about unannounced inspections of foreign establishments, and I haven't seen that, at least not with any of my foreign clients. But we are seeing requests for inspections, so they are happening. The inspections are happening. So despite there being staff cuts, and despite there being budgetary constraints, inspections are happening. So with that, I would anticipate seeing more enforcement, in the way of like 483 letters, or possibly import alerts, especially as what Claire mentioned, if the agency does start adopting AI for its reviews of incoming imports. So, which I think was mentioned during one of your podcasts when you were just talking about PCPC. So I think as AI development, happens at the agency, it's going to open up opportunities for the agency to be very efficient with how they do enforcement, right? Identifying potential problems with products coming in, whether that's looking at color additives or even drug claims, right? And how does the AI development impact how drug claims and kind of that ambiguous language that can happen? Because although the definition of what a drug is and what a cosmetic is very clear, right? It's kind of a bright line. When it comes to the marketing, right?
Right. Yeah.
That can be really ambiguous. So how does AI handle that?
Yeah.
I think that was going to be interesting to see.
And when you say, when you talk about announced sort of inspections, since the GMP cosmetic rules are still pending, but there's certainly international standards, ISO standards that that we recommend our clients follow. Are you seeing
Mhm.
that FDA is inspecting against those international standards for GMPs yet, or sort of what is the scope of the inspection? I know you commented on label claims and color additive compliance, but anything with respect to manufacturing that you're seeing?
Well, in a presentation that that FDA did earlier, was it earlier this year or last year? And I don't remember where it was at, but they were talking about the fact, yes, we recognize that there isn't an established FDA GMP rule.
Hmm.
We've got the international standards, and
Hmm.
FDA recognizes that, as well as their draft guidance. And if you go in and you look at the inspection like checklist that the FDA follows when they're doing inspections, it does really follow that
Right.
international standard.
Yeah.
But FDA has acknowledged in different presentations that it's at this point, because there isn't a rule, that it's really more about educating
Mm.
facilities at this point
Yeah.
until we actually have a rule in place. And so, at this point, now the inspections that I've seen get scheduled, they have not yet resulted in the 483s being released.
Hmm.
So a couple of the inspections have actually occurred. The inspections that I know of, from my clients have said, yeah, it went really well.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's promising
Yeah,
for the
yeah, no,
company.
that is. And I think that kind of tracks how FDA responded with FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act rollout, and the
Mhm.
updated GMPs with respect to foods under 117. They sort of kind of did this preliminary inspection, more of an educational outreach, similar to what you're discussing, Angela. And it was kind of like a slap on the wrist. If there was an issue, they were willing to note it and to have you move forward sort of as a corrective action rather than to issue a 43. So I think that's consistent. Um, so yeah, no, that's really really good, good to note. Wayne, I'll turn the next question over to you to Frank, please.
Yeah, thanks, Shelley. Frank, same question to you. What is the second most important development in the first half of the year with regard to food regulation?
Yeah, Wayne, the other one I would say, I think it's important just because FDA has made it really important. And it's what I call freaking out over food additives or artificial dyes. And I use that term somewhat humorously because there's been a frenzy of focus and activities on let's eliminate these artificial food colorings from the food system. I think it's significant. It's certainly where the agency is putting a lot of its focus. You hear the Secretary of HHS himself speaking about it. You hear the FDA Commissioner. Uh, and it's a host of food colorings that have been approved by FDA for use in the food system for a long, long time. I think it's significant in terms of how they're approaching it. Right now they're asking companies to voluntarily remove some of these food colorings, artificial food colorings. They're not requiring it. They have a very aggressive timeline when they're saying they want it out of the food system by the end of next year, which is aggressive. And they're approving natural dyes that we really don't know that much over. But I think it's significant for a couple of reasons. I think we have to ask ourselves three quick questions. Why is this one of the main things they're focusing on right out of the gate and putting so much emphasis on it? Number two, what will it achieve? And then number three, is it doable? Why? I'm not sure why this has been such a big focus. Certainly, it's popular among a lot of the groups, the Make America Healthy Again movement, a lot of moms. As you know, Wayne, the data is somewhat mixed. The FDA has approved a lot of these dyes with some scientific studies, and I know Science Evolves saying that they're safe under their uses. There are some emerging studies now that suggest it might lead to hyperactivity in kids, weaker evidence on some of them on potential cancer or disruption to the intestinal system. Uh, but it does seem like the FDA is moving, which is significant, towards a more precautionary principle mindset, which is something we always accuse Europe of doing. And it seems like we're doing that. I have no problem if the food industry wants to voluntarily remove these things. But the question why and why the focus on that? Is it doable? I've always been cautious as a leader to overpromise and underdeliver. It's in a large percentage of food products in the supermarket chain. So I would suspect, I'm not a betting person, but if I were, is that it won't be entirely removed by the end of 2026, and there'll still be foods in our grocery store that have artificial dyes. And then the third point, I think, is probably the most important one for Yiannas, which is I'm always a believer that you ought to be focusing on the majors and making the major things the major things. And when you sit in those seats at FDA, you have an obligation to look at the host of issues that you can work on, because there are so many, to significantly improve the public health of the nation. And will there be unintended consequences because we're so focused and we're putting the industry focused on this? Because industry will have limited capacity on what they can do. And there's other things that might achieve a better return on public health investment. The Secretary himself has said that he wants to make a measurable difference on public health in 2 short years. Again, that's an overly ambitious goal. I'm not sure that this is one of those types of activities that will result in measurable improvements to public health in 2 years. Now, not saying I'm against it. A lot of people don't want these. People say, why are they needed in food in the first place? They play a real functional and nutritional role. But could there be unintended consequences in terms of detracting or limiting industry's ability to do more important things?
We're going to take a short break now, but don't go anywhere because we'll be right back. And we're back. We're talking to Naomi Lowy, Claire Davies, Angela Diesch, and Frank Yiannas. Let me turn now to Naomi again in terms of the third most important development in the drug area.
Thank you, Wayne. So my final development is a shift from business as usual with the divisions. This is related to my second development, which was the great exodus of those with deep regulatory knowledge. And this third development is really the need for new expectations regarding timelines and bandwidth of the review teams with all the recent changes. So just to put this into perspective a little bit, a year ago, just when I was still deputy in a division in the Office of New Drugs, there were stringent expectations regarding meeting PDUFA goal dates, the expectation that it would be close to 100%, or it could be potentially reflected on our annual evaluations. But even a year ago, we needed more reviewers and we were actively trying to recruit. There were also sizable expectations to grant meetings and not convert to written responses only, in the hopes that there were more efficient, productive exchanges of information that were made in real time, where new ideas were spurred and progress was made on innovative or stalled development programs, progress that couldn't necessarily be made through the context of written responses only. So now we are seeing what I think was a predictable shift. We're repeatedly seeing conversions from meetings to written responses. We're seeing shortening of meetings that were typically 60 minutes to sometimes 30 minutes. We're also seeing responses from the divisions that, in complete transparency, state that their resources are limited. And these are the reasons why they can't have this in-person meeting. And this is unprecedented. The workload was already tremendous on, let's say, January 1st, 2025. And so it's understandable why the divisions must prioritize. This also puts some of the other issues we've discussed in context, and that is, what is the overall value of a few programs being granted a hyper expedited review timeline with the voucher program when the deadlines are routinely being missed? So what I would encourage industry to do is to advocate for addressing the root cause of the delays before getting overly excited about some of the new programs.
And it sort of goes without saying, but let me ask you anyway, what is the impact of all these changes on the development of drugs, on medical progress, on the larger things that FDA is concerned about, on consumer protection?
Well, the hope right, for the American public is that there will be minimal impacts. And again, I think that there is a lot of heterogeneity within all the within the divisions. Some in which the impacts have been very minimal, and others where we're repeatedly seeing a clear strain on the divisions because of resources. What I think is likely happening internally within FDA is internal prioritization to ensure that there are not impacts on the public health. And what I mean by that is prioritizing safety, right? So safety would be at the top. Anything, a 30-day safety IND, that would probably be at the top. Anything that does not have a user fee goal date attached to it would likely be at the bottom. So I think as as time goes on, we'll see exactly what the impacts of these are. But I also think that with increased strain on divisions, we may end up seeing a more conservative approach. If you don't really have the full complement of resources to make a decision, it's safer to go with a more conservative approach than to exercise flexibility.
Thanks, Naomi. Yes, Claire, if you would please provide your third and final top development in the medical device space in the first half of the year.
Sure. Thanks, Shelly. I think that the changes in leadership and sort of the reduction in staffing is for me just a thread that underlies everything happening at the agency.
Yeah.
Taking a bit of a device specific approach to this, I do think one thing that is a development is, comparatively speaking, and I want to preface this by saying this is not intended in any way to minimize the scope of these changes and staffing changes for CDRH, because they've been massive and there's been tremendous loss there. But I do think it's notable that Dr. Michelle Tarver, who's a career FDA official, currently remains as the center director. And I think that is an important source of stability right now for device policy. As you know, I think you and Wayne are aware, the commissioner has sort of a podcast from time to time that's also put on YouTube. They recently had, I finally had an episode with Dr. Tarver, and really covered a lot of things, talked about a lot of things that the center was already doing. I think some of the initiatives that CDRH has recently been promoting, like Home as a Healthcare Hub, which is looking at how devices are used in the home and as part of an integrated environment, and some of their other policies for digital health technology that they've been advancing for a long time, are potentially harmonized with some of Secretary Kennedy's focus on making healthcare more individual-driven, perhaps, than by physicians and public health agencies. We've heard about the Secretary favoring broad use of wearable devices. So I think there are ways in which, sort of some of that stability for now coming at the very top leadership of the center, and some of the direction the center has taken in the past being harmonized with sort of HHS and FDA priorities, is notable, because I think it stands in sharp contrast to some other areas for FDA regulated products.
Yeah. Thank you, Claire. Angela, turning to you for your third and final top development in the cosmetic space.
Well, for the third final development in the cosmetic space, I'd like to turn to the states, right? I think the first half of 2025, we saw the enactment or effectiveness of ingredient restrictions, right? We saw the restrictions from California, Colorado, Maryland, Minnesota, and Washington. January 1, 2025 is when they went into effect. The big one being that I'm getting questions on a lot is the 1 part per million for lead restriction. that's imposed by Washington State. And of course, we do have more ingredient restrictions in other states that are going to be coming into effect in January of 2026 and then 2027 as well. And then also the requirements under the extended producer responsibility rules, right? So in March was the first deadline for reporting to Circular Action Alliance for covered producers for imports or sales into Oregon. And we now, at the end of this month, is the reporting deadline for Colorado. So, that has been keeping cosmetic companies busy, right? Whether it's testing products, reviewing certificates of analysis of ingredients, to assess potential for lead contamination, and then figuring out, well, do these companies need to reformulate, right? So that's a big issue, and that requires a lot of resources for companies. Because it's not just reformulating is not an easy process, right? Changing just a handful of ingredients requires, additional preservation testing, challenge testing, stability, compatibility. So, it opens up a very big can of worms for companies when they have to reformulate. And unfortunately, the timelines for some companies for reformulation, it was just very, very tight. So, Washington did issue an interim policy for lead. And so it's going to be interesting to see, what comes out of that. Because the 1 part per million, I mean, that's very low, right? FDA's prior guidance for safety for lead was 10 parts per million. So it's significantly lower than what we've seen previously. And it's really the strictest standard for lead trace contamination, I believe, in the world. So that's been a big one. And, I think it's only going to continue to become a little bit more difficult for companies to, as they're trying to navigate these state by state requirements and reporting obligations. I've seen some clients having to, hire additional people just so they can try to, manage this in-house. And then others are, utilizing people like myself to help them with their reporting and with their testing. So,
thank you, Angela.
Thanks, Angela. Yeah. Let me now turn to Frank. Frank, your third most important development in the food regulatory area in the first half of the year.
Yeah, Wayne, I wouldn't say it's occurred, but I'm hopeful that it could occur. I mean, clearly with DOGE and the desire to try to make government more efficient, I hope, and at least one senator, Senator Cotton from Arkansas, has introduced a bill asking Secretary Rollins to take a look at what do we have to do as a nation to create a single food safety agency. And that's a big ideal. If you think about where we're at a transformational time in food. We're going to see more changes in food in the next 10 years than we have in the past 30. Food is so critical to the nation. Food security is national security. We have an administration that has a lot of support and enthusiasm, has both the House and the Senate. It's a unique opportunity in time to do something bold with food, in my view. And one of those bold measures is to get around to something that we've never thought could happen, which is to create a single food safety agency. We have 2 federal agencies that play the lion's share on food, USDA with about 20% of the food system and FDA with the other 80. We see, without strong federal leadership, Wayne, how a lot of states are getting involved in regulations, and I call it state regulatory activism. We can't have a patchwork of 50 different standards and still be involved in interstate commerce. That's really cumbersome. So I'm hopeful, with what Senator Cotton has proposed, and I'm hopeful that the administration will take a hard look at truly once and for all creating a single food safety agency. By the way, I'll remind your listeners that Trump did propose a single food safety agency during his first term and never got around to really getting it done. But my sense is, and certainly I hope they would try to act before midterms while they have the ability to get this done, as they get this done. Now, it's not just to restructure, Wayne. To me, it's not about who regulates what. It's how do we regulate food in a more consistent manner? How do we use the collective close to $3 billion, about 1.4 given to USDA and 1.4 to FDA on food safety? How do we use that more efficiently? And how do we use similar risk management concepts? I'll just do this real quickly and pass it on. Think about a pizza. If it's a cheese pizza, that pizza is regulated by FDA and inspected at best once every 5 years. If you put pepperonis on it, all of a sudden it gets regulated by USDA and it's inspected under continuous inspection. And that makes no sense. There's no logic or science to that. And worst case, pick a product that's even more concerning than pizza, powdered infant formula for the most vulnerable of U.S. consumers. That's inspected less than that pepperoni pizza because the agency does that once a year. And so it's time for us to bring some kind of saneness to our regulatory schemes and create a single food safety agency. It will be good for the American people.
Yeah, when I was at the agency, we talked about that on several occasions. When I was associate commissioner, we once even took a survey among various people at the agency and asked them, if we divided into a drug agency and a food agency, which would you go to? That's how much it was being thought about. But let me just ask one final question here, and that is, if you were the head of that merged agency, what would you do? What would you do differently than's being done now?
Wayne, it's a great question. I'm going to answer it head on. But let me tell you, I went into federal service without a strong opinion on this topic. Did we need a single food agency or not? I came out of 4.5 years of federal service convinced that it was needed. What would I do differently? I would, number one is I would create science-based risk management prioritizations that were consistent for all types of foods. I just gave you an example where some foods are under continuous inspection and some foods inspected once a year, and it has nothing to do with the risk of those foods. That's the first thing I'd do. I'd eliminate all the duplication of effort. I'd focus on using new and emerging technologies, Wayne, which I don't think we're doing enough of. It's not chasing shiny coins, but I gave you the example earlier on how we leverage machine learning to improve our predictive capabilities. And I'd probably leverage the partnership with the states a little bit closer, but those are some of the immediate things that come to mind.
Thank you very much, Frank. I want to thank Naomi, Claire, Angela, and Frank for being on the podcast today.
We really appreciate your insights and perspectives very much. And thanks to our podcast creator and producer, Michael Levin Epstein, and our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister. And as we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch.